History explained. History didn't forget these names. History buried them. Because remembering them would force America to confront an uncomfortable truth that freedom was not gifted, it was taken, and it was paid for in black blood. Before America became a nation, before the flag had meaning, before liberty was written into law, black men and women were already fighting for a future they were never promised. This is not a story about victims. This is a story about architects. Architects of resistance, architects of courage, architects of a freedom that would later deny them entry. Tonight, we are going to speak 5 names history tried to erase, not because they were insignificant, but because they were too powerful to remember. Stay with me, because by the end of this story, American history will no longer look the same. From the very beginning, the United States struggled with a contradiction. It declared that all men were created equal while building its economy, its military, and its political power on enslavement. That contradiction did not disappear. It was hidden, edited, rewritten. History books are not neutral. They are curated. They tell us who matters, and more importantly, who does not. For generations, classrooms celebrated founding fathers while ignoring the black hands that built the nation they claimed. They praised liberty while silencing those who demanded it most. They framed black people as passive observers of history, never as its drivers. But the truth is far more dangerous. Black Americans were not waiting to be freed. They were fighting to be free. They organized, they resisted, they educated, they spied, they bled. And when their actions threatened the official narrative, history erased their names. Erasure does not always look like destruction. Sometimes it looks like omission. A paragraph removed, a footnote ignored, a name never mentioned. Over time, silence becomes normal, and normal becomes accepted. But silence has consequences. When children never see heroes who look like them, they are taught that greatness belongs to someone else. When a nation forgets who paid the highest price for its freedom, it risks repeating the same injustices. This is why remembering matters, because memory is power, and power has always been contested in America. From the streets of colonial cities to the battlefields of revolution, from classrooms built during Reconstruction to polling stations guarded by violence, Black Americans were present at every turning point, not as side characters, but as central figures. Yet, when the story of America was told, they were pushed to the margins. Why? Because their existence challenged the myth that freedom was benevolent. Their lives proved that freedom had to be demanded, sometimes at the cost of life itself. The men and women you will hear about tonight were not radicals by accident. They were made radical by injustice. They believed in an America that did not yet exist. And for that belief, many of them paid with their lives, their safety, or their legacy. Some were killed in the streets. Some were silenced by textbooks. Some were remembered only in fragments, but none of them were insignificant. Their stories form a hidden backbone of American history. And when you connect those stories, a pattern emerges. A pattern of courage, a pattern of resistance, and a pattern of deliberate erasure. This erasure served a purpose, because if America admitted that Black heroes were essential to its survival, it would have to admit that racism was never accidental, it was structural. It would have to admit that democracy was expanded not by generosity, but by struggle. And it would have to admit that the fight for equality did not begin in the 20th century. It began the moment Black people set foot on this land, and refuse to accept their chains. Tonight, we reclaim what was hidden, not to rewrite history, but to complete it, because these names deserve more than a mention once a year. They deserve remembrance, respect, and recognition. As we move forward, understand this. Every hero you are about to meet stood at a crossroads of American history. Their choices shaped outcomes. Their courage changed directions. Their sacrifices made freedoms possible. And yet, history turned away from them. Until now. This is not just a lesson, it is a reckoning. So listen carefully, remember deliberately, and when their names appear, say them. Because a nation that forgets its true heroes cannot understand itself. And a people who reclaim their history reclaim their power. This is the story of 5 black heroes, erased, silenced, and finally, remembered. History explained. The American Revolution did not begin with a declaration. It began with blood on snow. Before speeches, before founding fathers, before liberty was written into law, a black man fell to the ground in Boston, and with him, the illusion of peace died. His name was Crispus Attucks. History often calls him a footnote, but footnotes do not ignite revolutions. Crispus Attucks was not a politician. He was not wealthy. He was not protected. He was a dock worker, a sailor, a man of African and native descent, living in a world that did not consider him fully human. Yet when violence came, he did not step back. He stepped forward. Boston, 1770. The city was tense. British soldiers occupied the streets. Colonists lived under constant surveillance. Jobs were scarce. Food was expensive. Anger simmered in taverns, docks, and alleyways. For black men like Attucks, life was even more dangerous. Freedom was fragile. Kidnapping into slavery was common. A single accusation could end everything. Still, Crispus Attucks walked the streets that night. Witnesses later described him as tall, strong, unafraid. When British soldiers confronted colonists on King Street, the crowd grew restless. Voices rose, snowballs flew, insults turned into defiance. And at the front of that crowd stood Attucks. Not hiding, not running, standing. He carried no gun, no uniform, no authority, only conviction. When the shots rang out, chaos followed. 5 men fell. Crispus Attucks was the first. A musket ball tore into his chest. He collapsed onto frozen ground. Blood stained the snow beneath him. The revolution had claimed its first martyr. But history would hesitate to call him that, because acknowledging Crispus Attucks meant acknowledging something dangerous, that a black man was willing to die for American liberty before America was willing to die for him. His death shocked the colonies. Pamphlets spread, engravings circulated, funeral processions filled the streets. Thousands attended his burial, black and white together. For a moment, the truth was undeniable. A black man had died resisting tyranny. Yet as the years passed, his name faded. The Boston Massacre became a rallying cry, but the man who fell first was quietly pushed aside. Textbooks softened his presence. Paintings blurred his face. Narratives shifted. The revolution became cleaner, whiter, more comfortable. Crispus Attucks did not fit the myth. He complicated it, because he proved that black resistance was not reactive, it was foundational. He was not fighting for a future that included him. He was fighting for the idea of freedom itself, and that made him dangerous to forget. Imagine what it means to stand unarmed before soldiers who see you as expendable. Imagine knowing your death would likely go unpunished and still choosing to stand. That is not recklessness, that is courage. Crispus Attucks did not live to see independence. He never voted, never owned land, never benefited from the nation his death helped birth. But make no mistake, when Americans say freedom has a price, his blood was part of the payment. Tonight, we say his name not as a symbol, but as a man who stood at the front of history when history did not intend to remember him. Crispus Attucks was not the first Black American to resist oppression, but he was the first to die publicly for the cause of American liberty, and that truth can no longer be buried. History explained. Reconstruction was supposed to be a rebirth, a second chance for America to become what it claimed to be. Slavery was over, the Civil War had ended, and on paper, Black men were finally citizens. But paper does not protect you from bullets. In Philadelphia, in the year 1871, a Black man dared to believe the promise. His name was Octavius Catto. He believed that freedom meant more than survival. It meant participation. It meant dignity. It meant the right to move, to vote, and to exist without fear. Octavius Catto was not reckless. He was educated, strategic, relentless. He understood something many refused to admit, that the Civil War had ended slavery, but it had not ended racism. After the war, white resistance hardened. Black voters were intimidated. Polling places were guarded by mobs. Streetcars were segregated. Violence became a political tool, and Catto stood directly in its path. He organized Black voters in Philadelphia. He challenged streetcar segregation through boycotts and lawsuits. He trained Black soldiers during the Civil War. He believed discipline and unity were weapons. But belief makes you visible, and visibility makes you a target. Election Day, October 10th, 1871. The city was tense. Rumors of violence filled the air. White mobs roamed the streets, determined to stop Black men from voting. Catto knew the danger. Still, he put on his coat and stepped outside. Because democracy, if it meant anything at all, meant showing up even when your life was on the line. He walked through Philadelphia streets knowing he was marked. At a polling station, chaos erupted. Gunshots echoed. Men screamed. Votes were stolen by force. Catto moved to intervene, not with violence, but with resolve. That was enough. A white assailant confronted him. Words were exchanged. Then a pistol was raised. The shot was fatal. Octavius Catto collapsed on the street, bleeding out on the same ground where he had fought for equality. He was 32 years old. The man who killed him was never truly punished, and once again, America looked away. Newspapers mourned briefly. Politicians issued hollow statements. Then silence returned. Catto's death sent a message that Black political participation would be met with terror, that citizenship could be revoked by violence, that freedom was conditional. But Catto's life told a different story. He proved that Black Americans were not passive recipients of rights. They were architects of democracy. He understood that voting was not symbolic, it was power. And power was exactly what white supremacist violence sought to destroy. Over time, his name faded from national memory. The civil rights movement of the 20th century would be taught as if it appeared from nowhere. But men like Octavius Catto laid the groundwork. They tested the limits. They paid the price. They exposed the lie that progress was peaceful. Catto was assassinated not because he broke the law, but because he believed in it, because he demanded that America obey its own constitution. His death was not random. it was political. And remembering him forces us to confront a hard truth, that democracy in America has always been contested, and that Black participation has always been met with resistance. Octavius Catto did not live to see justice, but his courage echoes every time someone votes in defiance of fear. He reminds us that the ballot has always been dangerous in the wrong hands, and that some Americans were killed simply for insisting it belonged to them. Tonight, we say his name, not as a footnote, not as a victim, but as a defender of democracy. Octavius Catto was murdered for voting, and that truth must never be erased.
History explained. The American Revolution was not won by muskets alone. It was won by information, by whispers carried across camps, by lies carefully planted, by courage that operated in silence. One of the most effective weapons of the Revolution never wore a uniform. He carried no rank, and for most of the war, he was not even free. His name was James Armistead Lafayette. James Armistead was born enslaved in Virginia. Like millions of others, his life was claimed by a system that denied him humanity, voice, and choice. But war has a way of opening cracks in even the strongest chains. When the American colonies rebelled against Britain, both sides needed intelligence. They needed eyes inside enemy camps. They needed someone invisible. James Armistead was exactly that. Enslaved Black men were often ignored, overlooked, assumed to be harmless. That assumption would cost the British everything. With permission from his enslaver, Armistead volunteered to spy for the Continental Army, not as a soldier, but as a ghost. He entered British camps posing as a runaway slave seeking work. The British welcomed him. They trusted him. They spoke freely around him. And James listened. He memorized troop movements, supply routes, battle plans. He carried this information back through forests and roads, risking torture or execution if discovered. Later, he did something even more dangerous. He became a double agent. James fed false intelligence to British officers, convincing them that American forces were weak and divided, that reinforcements were coming, that delay was safe. Those lies shaped British decisions. Those decisions led directly to Yorktown. In 1781, British General Cornwallis moved his troops to the Virginia coast, believing escape was possible. It was not. Thanks in large part to intelligence provided by James Armistead, American and French forces surrounded the British Army. The trap closed. Yorktown became the final major battle of the Revolutionary War. When Cornwallis surrendered, America celebrated its victory, but James Armistead Lafayette remained enslaved. Freedom had been won for a nation, but not for the man who helped secure it. After the war, James petitioned for his freedom. He had proof, but proof was not enough. Only when the Marquis de Lafayette personally testified on his behalf did Virginia grant his emancipation. In gratitude and pride, James took the name James Armistead Lafayette. It was a name earned through risk, intelligence, and sacrifice. Yet history would barely whisper it. Textbooks praised generals, statues honored officers, but the enslaved spy who delivered victory faded into obscurity. Why? Because his story exposed a truth America struggled to accept, that an enslaved Black man outwitted the British Empire, that freedom depended on someone denied freedom, that intelligence, not brute force, won the war. James Armistead Lafayette lived quietly after emancipation. He never sought fame, he never demanded recognition, but his work reshaped the world. Without his intelligence, Yorktown may have ended differently. Without Yorktown, independence may have been delayed or lost. America owes its birth to a man it nearly forgot. James Armistead Lafayette reminds us that history's most powerful figures are often the least visible, that resistance does not always shout, sometimes it whispers, and that freedom has always been secured by people who were never meant to have it. Tonight, we remember the spy who stood between empires, the man who lied so a nation could live, the hero who won a war while still in chains. History explained. Freedom did not arrive with celebration for everyone. For many, it arrived quietly, uncertain, and dangerously incomplete. When slavery ended, millions of Black Americans were declared free, yet left without protection, education, or resources. The law had changed, but the world around them had not. In that fragile moment, when the future of Black freedom could still be undone, one woman chose to walk directly into the aftermath of bondage. Her name was Charlotte Forten Grimke. She was born free in Philadelphia into a family of prominent Black abolitionists. Education surrounded her. Literature shaped her mind. Opportunity, rare for a Black woman of her time, shaped her early life. But comfort did not satisfy her conscience. When the Civil War broke the chains of slavery, Charlotte Forten did not remain safely in the North. She traveled south into former slave territory, where resentment still burned and violence lingered in the air. She went not as a soldier, but as a teacher. In the Sea Islands of South Carolina, formerly enslaved men, women, and children gathered in makeshift classrooms. Many had never held a book. Many had been punished for learning letters. All understood that knowledge was power. Charlotte understood it too. She taught reading, writing, and discipline, but she also taught dignity. She taught self-worth. She taught children who had been treated as property that they were human beings with futures. Her classroom was not safe. Confederate sympathizers remained nearby. Disease spread easily. Supplies were scarce. Threats were constant. Yet, Charlotte stayed. She wrote in her journals about exhaustion, fear, and loneliness. She also wrote about joy, about watching a child read their first sentence, about witnessing curiosity bloom where silence once lived. Education was resistance. Every lesson challenged the old order. Every word learned weakened the lie that Black people were inferior or incapable. Charlotte Forten Grimke knew she was shaping more than students. She was shaping citizens. At a time when Black education was viewed as dangerous, she made it unavoidable. Her health suffered. Teaching under such conditions drained her physically and emotionally. Still, she refused to abandon her post because she understood something vital. Freedom without education was simply another form of control. After the war, Charlotte continued to write, to teach, and to advocate. Her poetry and essays captured the emotional reality of Black life in America with rare honesty and depth. She documented not just progress, but pain. She married into the Grimke family, aligning herself with one of the most influential abolitionist legacies in American history. Yet, within reform movements, Black women were often sidelined. Charlotte persisted anyway. History often celebrates loud victories, battles won, laws passed, speeches delivered. But Charlotte Forten Grimke fought a quieter war. She fought ignorance. She fought despair. She fought the belief that Black children did not deserve a future. Her work did not make headlines. It did not end in martyrdom. It did something more lasting. It built minds. Those children carried knowledge into adulthood. They became teachers, leaders, and parents who passed learning forward. Generations felt the ripple. And yet Charlotte Forten Grimke rarely appears in textbooks. Her story does not fit the dramatic arc history prefers. She was not assassinated. She did not command armies. She simply refused to let freedom die in silence. In a nation struggling to redefine itself, she insisted that education was the foundation of any true democracy. Her legacy reminds us that revolutions are not sustained by force alone. They're sustained by classrooms, books, and people willing to teach under threat. Charlotte Fortin Grimke stood at the crossroads of freedom and forgetting. She chose memory. She chose responsibility. And because she did, countless others were given the tools to choose their own futures. Tonight, we remember her not as a footnote, but as a builder of freedom. Because sometimes the bravest act is not to fight with weapons, but to teach when the world tells you not to. History explained. America has always struggled with black men who refuse to ask for permission. It could tolerate obedience, it could tolerate patience, it could tolerate silence, but it feared independence. No figure embodied that fear more clearly than Martin Delany. Delany was not born into power, he was born into contradiction. A free black man in a nation built on bondage, he learned early that freedom without authority was fragile. Knowledge became his weapon. Discipline became his shield. He studied medicine when black men were barred from most institutions. He became one of the first black students admitted to Harvard Medical School, only to be forced out when white students protested his presence. The message was clear. Excellence would be punished. Delany refused to shrink. He became a newspaper editor, publishing radical ideas that challenged both slavery and white paternalism. He believed black people could not rely on the moral conscience of others for survival. Freedom, he argued, must be defended. Delany worked alongside abolitionists, including Frederick Douglass, but he differed in one crucial way. Where others hoped America would change, Delany prepared for the possibility that it would not. He believed black self-determination was not optional, it was necessary. When the Civil War erupted, Delany saw opportunity within catastrophe. If black men fought, he believed, they must fight as equals. He pushed relentlessly for black enlistment, not as laborers, not as expendable bodies, but as soldiers and leaders. In 1865, Delany achieved what few thought possible. He was commissioned as a major in the United States Army, becoming the first black field officer in American history. The achievement was historic. The response was silence. White officers resented him, black soldiers admired him, the government tolerated him. Delany understood the danger of being tolerated. He traveled through the South recruiting black troops, speaking to men who had only recently escaped slavery. He told them something revolutionary, that they were not inferior, that they were not temporary, that they belonged to the future of this nation. But Delany was too uncompromising. He rejected gradualism, he rejected dependence, he rejected the idea that black freedom required white approval. That made him dangerous. After the war, as Reconstruction faltered, Delany watched America retreat from its promises. Federal troops withdrew, white violence surged, black political power was systematically dismantled. Delany warned that without protection, freedom would collapse. History proved him right. He explored black emigration, seeking land and sovereignty beyond American borders. Critics accused him of separatism. Delany called it survival. He understood that citizenship without safety was a lie. Unlike many of his contemporaries, Delany refused to soften his language for comfort. He spoke plainly, he wrote boldly, he demanded equality without apology. And for that, history pushed him aside. Textbooks remembered the abolitionists who reassured white audiences. They forgot the man who told uncomfortable truths. Delany died in 1885, his vision unrealized, his warnings ignored. Yet his ideas never disappeared. They resurfaced in Garveyism, in black nationalism, in every movement that insisted dignity required power. Martin Delany was not erased because he failed. He was erased because he succeeded too early. He imagined a future America was not ready to face,
a nation where Black people were not pleading participants, but equal architects. Tonight, we remember Martin Delany not as a radical, but as a realist, a man who understood that freedom without strength is temporary, and that dignity without self-determination is fragile. He was not asking for inclusion, he was demanding recognition, and history could not forgive him for that.
History explained. History does not forget by accident. It forgets by design. Erasure is not the absence of memory. It is the presence of intention. Across generations, names disappear not because they were unimportant, but because they were inconvenient, because their stories disrupt comfort, because they expose power. The pattern is always the same. First comes sacrifice, then comes silence. Black Americans have always stood at the center of the nation's turning points. At moments of revolution, reconstruction, and reform, they were present, active, decisive. But when the story was written, they were reduced to margins. This was not coincidence, it was strategy. History is not simply recorded, it is curated. Those who control institutions decide which stories are preserved and which are buried. They decide which courage is celebrated and which resistance is minimized. In early America, Black heroism created a problem. It challenged the myth that freedom was benevolent. It proved that liberty was demanded, not granted. So the response was not denial, it was omission. Textbooks emphasized founding fathers while ignoring Black patriots. Paintings framed revolutions without Black faces. Memorials honored victories without acknowledging who bled. Over time, absence became tradition. Generations grew up believing Black Americans were passive recipients of progress rather than its architects. This belief served a purpose. If Black people were not central to the nation's survival, then their demands for equality could be dismissed. If their sacrifices were invisible, their claims to citizenship could be questioned. Erasure preserved hierarchy. It allowed America to celebrate itself without confronting its contradictions. After emancipation, the pattern intensified. Reconstruction offered Black Americans political power, education, and representation. For a brief moment, the story threatened to change. Then came backlash. Violence replaced law. Terror replaced policy, and memory was reshaped to justify retreat. Black leaders were assassinated. Black voters were intimidated. Black schools were destroyed. And when these crimes could not be hidden, they were reframed. Victims were blamed. Resistance was labeled disorder. Progress was declared premature. History followed suit. Reconstruction was taught as a failure rather than a betrayal. Black political participation was framed as chaos rather than democracy. The lesson was clear. Black ambition was dangerous. Black autonomy was unacceptable. As decades passed, the erasure refined itself. Erasure became quieter, more polished, more respectable. Instead of outright denial, there was selective emphasis. Instead of silence, there was minimization. Black figures were included, but only if they were non-threatening, only if they reassured power rather than challenged it. Radicals were excluded. Strategists were forgotten. Those who demanded self-determination were erased. This selective memory shaped national identity. It taught America to celebrate progress without acknowledging struggle, to praise freedom without recognizing cost. It taught Black children to search for themselves in history books and find absence. That absence carried weight, because memory shapes possibility. When people do not see themselves in the past, they struggle to imagine themselves in the future. When courage is hidden, fear becomes normalized. Erasure is not neutral, it is harmful. It robs individuals of legacy. It robs communities of pride. It robs nations of truth.
And truth, when delayed, does not disappear. It returns. It returns in protests, in movements, in demands to be seen. Every generation of Black Americans has been forced to reclaim history that was deliberately withheld, not to rewrite it, but to complete it. The pattern of erasure reveals something deeper about power. Power is not only enforced through violence, it is maintained through memory. By controlling what is remembered, institutions control what is considered possible. That is why erasure persists, because acknowledging Black agency would require admitting that inequality was not accidental but constructed, and constructions can be dismantled. The stories you have heard in this series are not exceptions, they are evidence. Evidence that Black Americans have always been thinkers, fighters, educators, and leaders. Evidence that freedom has always depended on people denied its protection. To remember them is not symbolic, it is corrective. It challenges inherited myths, it disrupts comfortable narratives, it demands accountability. This is why remembering feels dangerous, because once truth is acknowledged, silence becomes impossible. History is not finished, it is contested, and the act of remembering is itself resistance. To speak erased names is to reject the version of America that required forgetting them. To teach these stories is to expand the definition of patriotism, not as blind loyalty, but honest engagement. The pattern of erasure survives only when it goes unchallenged, and every time a forgotten name is spoken, that pattern weakens. Tonight, we have traced the outlines of what was hidden, not to dwell in pain, but to reclaim agency, because a nation cannot understand itself without confronting who it chose to forget, and freedom cannot endure without memory.
History explained. History is not finished. It is still being argued over. Every generation decides what it will remember and what it will ignore. Every nation chooses which stories it will honor and which ones it will bury. What you have heard in this series is not hidden history. It is denied history. The difference matters. Hidden history can be uncovered by accident. Denied history must be confronted on purpose. The names you heard were never lost. They were pushed aside, softened, or erased because they challenged power. They proved that Black Americans were never passive spectators of freedom. They were its engineers. Crispus Attucks did not die in confusion. He died resisting armed soldiers in the street. Octavius Catto did not fall randomly. He was hunted for organizing voters. James Armistead Lafayette did not stumble into history. He outwitted an empire. Charlotte Fortin Grimke did not simply teach. She rebuilt minds where chains once ruled. Martin Delany did not dream unrealistically. He saw clearly and too early. Together, their lives expose a truth America has struggled to accept. Freedom was never inevitable. It was forced into existence by people who were denied its protection. This is the reckoning, because once you understand that truth, neutrality becomes impossible. Silence becomes a choice. Forgetting becomes participation. Erasure is not harmless. It shapes policy. It shapes culture. It shapes whose pain is believed and whose courage is dismissed. When Black heroism is erased, injustice appears accidental instead of deliberate. Inequality looks natural instead of engineered. That is why memory matters. Remembering these stories does not divide America, it clarifies it. It shows that democracy did not grow because it was kind, but because it was challenged. It shows that progress was never a gift handed down, but a demand pushed upward. This understanding changes responsibility. If freedom was built by struggle, then protecting it requires effort. If equality was won through resistance, then maintaining it demands vigilance. The danger is not that these stories exist.
The danger is that they were ignored. Because ignorance is convenient. It allows injustice to repeat itself wearing new language. It allows the same exclusions to be defended as tradition. It allows power to claim innocence. But once names are spoken, innocence disappears. This is why remembrance has always frightened those in control. Because memory connects past to present. It reveals patterns. It exposes continuity. When you see the pattern, you cannot unsee it. The erasure of Black heroes was not a failure of history. It was a function of it. It protected narratives that justified inequality. It maintained myths that centered comfort over truth. But myths cannot survive scrutiny forever. Every generation that asks better questions weakens them. This is that moment. To remember these names is not to rewrite America. It is to finish the sentence it left incomplete. It is to say that patriotism does not mean silence. It means honesty. It means loving a country enough to tell the truth about it. And truth demands participation. So the call to action is simple, but not easy. Say their names. Teach them. Refuse to let them fade back into silence. Memory is not passive. It is an act. When you speak these names, you interrupt the pattern. When you share these stories, you weaken erasure. When you demand accuracy, you reclaim agency. This is not about guilt. It is about responsibility. History cannot change what it refuses to acknowledge. A nation cannot heal what it pretends never happened. The future depends on what we choose to remember now. Because children will inherit the stories we pass down. They will build their understanding of possibility from what we show them. If they only see freedom without struggle, they will not recognize injustice when it returns. If they never see Black courage honored, they will be taught that power belongs elsewhere. But if they learn the truth, they inherit resilience. They learn that resistance is American, that courage is American, that demanding justice is not betrayal, but tradition. This is the legacy these heroes left behind. Not statues, not slogans, but responsibility. To remember, to speak, to refuse erasure. History will continue to test that responsibility. The question is no longer whether these heroes mattered. The record is clear. The question is whether we will. Because history is not only what happened, it is what we allow to matter. Tonight, their names return to the story. Not as footnotes, not as exceptions, but as foundations. Say them, carry them, pass them forward. That is how erasure ends.